Well, today's Sunday, and kind of want to go over the sovereign debt and what it could mean. Watching the decisions of the governments today to see if we can't figure out what path that they have chosen that they're going to go on. All right. So we know our last video we talked about that percent of Treasury is starting to buy Treasuries. Okay. Not crazy. It's the fourth time it's happened from our past. And Bissett has said if Powell doesn't cut interest rates, he's going to start buying back bonds to drive down the long-term rates. If anyone looked at Friday, I believe in the video the interest rates were 447. We closed Friday at 451. So we went up and hit that number that sent the bond market into a tizzy a couple months ago, or a month ago, with the Liberation Day. Okay, but let's look around at what's going on. Now in China, and again, I'm just going to say no one knows. People say they have debt of 350, 360%. The reason it's so difficult, remember, they have the central bank, and then they have all their, what we might call states or regions, and those local people do most of the borrowing. The central government says you borrow, and they go and borrow, but that's what happens, okay? So we can't add them all. We don't have access to all the information, so people are estimating it's around 360%. But anyway, they go in and they do an open market outright reverse repo tenders for 1 trillion yen, about $139 billion. Now, the reason this is important, or I think it has import, is that it was just last October 2024 that the Chinese government did their first repo. So they're expanding their toolkit, you might say, or they're expanding their toolkit because they have to. Now here's an article out of China explaining that this will be a 3-month tenor, as they call it, which means how long, it's actually 91 days. And this one is interesting because they're going to do it just a little bit differently than we do it. And we're going to go over on how they're going to do this and what does that actually mean. Okay, so here's the 4 characteristics of this repo. It's a 3-month tenor. We just talked about that. It's a fixed quantity. So in other words, they said, look, we're gonna lend 1 trillion yuan. We're going to do a trillion yuan. All right. Now the difference is the companies and the institutions can bid at what interest rate do they want it. So really what they're going to do is they're going to say, we're going to accept different levels of bids for different companies and different institutions. And I guess, there are some companies that work on thin margins, some that have thicker margins. Maybe that's the reason they're doing that. I'm not sure. We don't do it that way, as you know. And they're saying that the winning bidders may pay their own bid rates rather than a single uniform rate, meaning different participants may receive different funds at different interest rates based on their bids. So this is different, but I think they're trying to design it for the companies and the institutions that are borrowing so that they can afford to borrow. The other thing in a repo is we have to remember something. Here's a description of how we do our repos, all right? And really, in the middle here, the Fed to the bank, we buy your treasuries today for $1 billion and buy them back tomorrow for $1,000,001, okay? So in other words, they buy the securities from you, and when they buy the securities from you, you say, I will buy them back at X price tomorrow. That's what a repo is. Why do repos happen? Banks and financial institutions, they have liabilities, they have assets, they add them up at the end of the night, and if they're short, they take some of their securities, they lend them to the Fed or another bank, and they do it at the SOFR rate, and they bring the cash in and they balance the books for the night. So the reverse repo, the tenor being 91 days, that is definitely different, all right? So they want these people to have liquidity for at least 91 days. Now, you guys and we can guess, is this because of the tariffs and the shutdown, what's going on right now, that they're keeping them alive for 3 months? I don't know. What do you think? All right. I thought it was interesting, given what we're doing with the Treasury, to look at what they say, the difference between Fed repos and Treasury buybacks. All right, so the Fed, who does it? The Federal Reserve, who buys back from the U.S. Treasury. It's literally like the government. It's for the Fed, it's a controlled interest rate and managed bank reserves. For the Treasury, it's reduced debt costs and manage the portfolio. For the Fed, they create new bank reserves electronically, i.e., they print the money. The Treasury uses existing cash, all right? And the Fed accepts treasuries and MBS, mortgage-backed securities, from the banks, where the Treasury buys back outstanding issues. One of my commentators on TikTok, SJT, I think, said that they're buying back bonds like 70 cents on the dollar because the interest rates are up, so they're buying it back cheaper, okay? But here's what I want to talk about. We're throwing liquidity into the market, and so are the Chinese. We're the two biggest economies by far in the world. It's not even close, all right? And so both of us are throwing massive amounts of liquidity into the market again. Notice our M2 hit an all-time high last week again, all right? So the two biggest economies, the two biggest banks are throwing liquidity into the market. Now look this is the OECD and the emerging market debt. You can see it's around 20 trillion. We're setting records every single year. And I just want to remind you, US is at 36 trillion. So everybody's are issuing more and more bonds. That's the point, okay? And while we're issuing more and more bonds, we're having some of the fastest rate cuts by central banks around the world at this time, all right? So you can see 2008, we're basically hitting around 2008 now. We're down there a little bit. But as you can see, in the last, since the great financial crisis, this is not a small deal, okay? So why are they cutting their rates? Well, all the tariffs have been announced, and I know everyone's still arguing over everything, but let's face it, they're going to be 10 to 25%. And here's a study of all the countries and what's going to happen to them when the tariffs come in. How is their GDP going to react? And as you can see, nobody is positive. Nobody whatsoever. And here's the currencies are the ones we're hitting the hardest, and you can see they're all up against the dollar, or most of them. And what does this mean? This slows down the economy. So even though the tariffs are coming, central banks are cutting their rates, the tariffs are going to hit our economy, they're hitting the currencies, actually dragging down the economies again, our long bonds are going up for our major sovereign countries. All right? So in other words, we should be going down in yield. We're actually going up in yield. So what can we infer from this? I did a video, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. There's so many things happening, I don't remember. And I said, which way are the banks going to go? They can defend their economy, they can defend their currency, or they can control their interest rates. You can only do one of the three. You can't do all three. And it seems, on the face of it, that now that the central banks are betting on that they're going to do some form of QE, they're going to cut the interest rates, and they're going to print more debt. Now, when we think about this, you got to remember something. With all this tariff stuff going on, the supply chains are being redone. They say that America alone, we need 2.9 trillion to spend on our supply chain to get into the new world. 2.9 trillion. So all the countries are facing the same thing. The Europeans, they have to do defense. They have all the social programs over there. How are they all going to do this if they don't print and buy their debt? What do you think? Like and follow, tell me in the comments.